Dear colleagues, dear ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to welcome Naomi Oreskes. I always wanted to meet you, actually, and I never did, although you are one of my favorite professors worldwide, because you dare to change subjects profoundly. You are a professor of the history of science, but she's not trained in history. She's trained in geology, which I just admire. I think it's a great subject, and I was actually very good in it while at school, but I never dared to study it because I thought it's too complicated. So I also, of course, have read your famous publications. The first one, Beyond the Ivory Tower, which I quoted a lot. It has been published in Science in 2004. And then, of course, the book and also watching the film, Margins of Doubt, how a handful of scientists obscured the truth on issues from tobacco to global warming. Now, I just have written a book myself, which in part became a little film, and I know that this is quite interesting, but also, extremely time-consuming. So I wonder where you have the time to publish in Science, which I never did, so congratulations, and also, to work in this area, which is so very, very important, not just in the US, but increasingly also in Germany. And we have one thing in common. Probably more than one thing, but we have one thing in common, and this is that it's the very same day the two of us talked, you in the United States and I'm here, and it was part of the March of Science, and in Berlin there were 10,000 people, I think, or at least this is what journalists guess. And I think you talked in front of 100,000. So this shows very, very well the difference between the two of us and your enormous impact and my little one. It's a small but wonderful institution, I think. The other important difference is that we started our talks quite differently. And I'm not going to bore you with my introduction to my talk. It's a March of Science, but I would like to quote how she opened her talk, which I find quite fantastic. So I quote, "We don't want to be here," she says to 100,000 people. And of course, they were quite enthusiastic, coming and crowding. "We want," and I quote her again, "we want to do the work that we were trained to do. But that work is under attack," she said, "and like a family that must respond in self-defense to burglars in their home, scientists now have to protect themselves and their values." And this is exactly what we have to do, and this is not just something she is working for. We all have to work towards this issue. And it's my big pleasure that I find many, many extremely important, you may not know this, people working in the city of Berlin coming today at the WZB, and I'm just introducing the former president of the Academy of Berlin, the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy. This is Herr Stock, who is sitting there, and I could name many other different people which are important and have now the pleasure to listen to you. I should also say that this is a series which has not been organized from the top of the organization and then that let's have a new lecture series, but that there were young, curious people gathering the first time after the election of Trump, saying we have to organize ourselves as well. So thank you for some are here. Thank you very, very much. I didn't know that you are back from New York, because otherwise you would have given the introduction. So thank you for the young people organizing themselves over all disciplines which we have to start such a series, and thank you in particular that you made your way here to Berlin before you have to go to Hanover, and the weather in Hanover is not better than the weather is here, but Berlin is probably a little bit interesting. But I already conveyed my thanks to Wilhelm Kroll, of course. So thank you very much for coming, and we are eager to listen to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that extremely overly generous introduction. But
it was not overly generous.
But it is a great pleasure to be back in Berlin and to have the opportunity to talk to all of you today. So it's often said that we have a crisis of trust in science, particularly in the United States. And I want to argue today that that's partly true, but partly not. If you actually look at the public opinion polls, we find a rather mixed situation. On the negative side, we have subjects like climate change and evolution, where we know we have a serious problem. Approximately 50% of the American people, even today, are not wholly convinced of the reality of anthropogenic climate change, or at least they're not convinced of its severity as an issue. If we look at evolutionary biology, the situation is even worse. And this question is very sensitive to how you frame it. So depending upon how you frame the question, between 50 and 90% of Americans hold views that are at odds with the scientific conclusions that humans and other species have evolved over the course of Earth history. Now, one reason that number is so high is it turns out that a very large percentage of Americans do accept evolutionary theory to explain bugs and plants and worms and shellfish and even gorillas, but not human beings. So I call them Homo sapiens exceptionalists. Now on the upside, though, is actually almost everything else. All of the available data shows that actually most scientists do not reject the theory of plate tectonics, the reality of DNA, the relativity of time and space, the existence of atoms, etc., etc. In fact, we find that in nuanced studies, we find that most Americans do respect science, and they do believe scientists, at least more than they believe politicians, the media, or business leaders. And also most Americans, about 90 to 95%, have had their children vaccinated. So we hear a lot about the vaccination problem because of the issue of herd immunity, that if as many as 10% of people don't get their children vaccinated, then we begin to lose herd immunity. So it's very serious from a public health perspective, but in terms of belief in science or trust in science, we find the vast majority of American people do accept the value of vaccination. So this tells us that what we have is not a general crisis of trust in experts, but it's actually a specific rejection of areas of science that clash with some people's, I'm in Germany, so I can say Weltanschauung. People reject science when its implications appear to clash with their worldview, their political ideology, or their religious faith. So we call this implicatory rejection. That is to say, people reject science because of its implications. So in the case of evolutionary theory, we see a clash with evangelical Christians who are committed to certain literal readings of the Bible, or who think that evolutionary theory implies that life has no purpose. And we see this in much creationist literature, the implication being drawn, well, if we evolved, if evolution is a random process, then that tells us God has no plan for us. And the same with climate change, although the set of issues is different. Climate change, climate science clashes with libertarian and laissez-faire capitalist worldviews for people who believe that it implies a government takeover of the marketplace and that threatens American freedom and the American way of life. So just to give you one example of this from our book, Merchants of Doubt, this man, Fred Singer, is a famous physicist. He was the first head of the US National Weather Satellite Program in the 1960s. So he's a highly educated man. He's not illiterate in science, but he worked with the Philip Morris Tobacco Company to defend cigarettes and to attack the scientific evidence of the harms of secondhand smoke. And in his own words, he explained why he did this. He said, if we do not carefully delineate the government's role in regulating dangers, there is essentially no limit to how much government can ultimately control our lives. And we see this theme as well being used by a variety of different conservative and Republican politicians in America, the idea that government intervention in the marketplace threatens the American way of life. So George H.W. Bush, for example, who many people feel was the last American Republican who had reasonable positions, well, I was going to say on climate change, but you could say actually on anything, but who was generally viewed as a rational person, and who signed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, he was not a climate change denier, and yet even he, when asked about how far the United States should go, he said, one thing we have to be clear about, and this is a direct quote, the American way of life is not up for negotiation. So this helps to explain why the phenomenon of climate change denial is particularly strong in the United States, because of the cultural history of Protestant religion in America and the prevalence of evangelical Christianity in particular, and its strong influence in the American Republican Party since Ronald Reagan. And also, simultaneously, because of the role of the fossil fuel industry and think tanks in promoting climate change denial by drawing on conservatives' fear of government intervention, lingering anti-communism, and a commitment to an individualist worldview. So these two different independent trends, the history of American Protestant religiosity and the power of the fossil fuel industry, coupled with laissez-faire economic views, have come together to create a very potent mix. So the rejection of science in these cases is a political problem, not an epistemic one. And this is a point that I've tried to underscore because many scientists think that climate change denial can be solved with more science. And that is a misdiagnosis of the problem. We cannot solve a political problem with more scientific data. And it won't be solved with better understanding or communication of the science, even though, of course, those are good things. And I want to be clear, I'm not against good science or good communication. I'm very much in favor of those things. But they're not a solution to the problem of the rejection of science. So that's everything I've said today. Was really based on my previous work, the work I did with Eric Conway in the book and the film Merchants of Doubt. But since then, I've been working on some additional questions where we've tried to dig deeper into one issue that I've been interested in my entire professional career, and which I think does require deeper intellectual and epistemic scrutiny. And that's the problem that I call colloquially when scientists get it wrong. So when I give public lectures in the United States, sometimes people in the audience will ask the question, usually in a very hostile tone of voice. Generally, it's an older white man. I'm just saying this as an empirical observation. They stand up and they say, why should we believe scientists when they're always getting it wrong? And if you ask the interlocutor, well, what is the it there? Usually they can't actually answer the question. There's just a sort of general sense that scientists get everything wrong. So that question framed that way need not particularly detain us. But there is a kind of kernel of truth there. We do know, I'm a geologist turned historian of science, we know that there are conspicuous examples in the history of science where scientists came to conclusions that in hindsight we would find to be wrong, mistaken, erroneous, incomplete, and in some cases noxious. And of course, the most famous work in the history of science, Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, was built on this observation that scientific revolutions aren't just small adjustments in scientific thinking, but they're radical reformulations of epistemic commitments. So in the last couple of years, I've been trying to do a kind of big high-altitude pass over the history of science. So this is something that's a little risky because obviously there could be experts in the audience who know more about particular cases than I do, but it's also potentially very rewarding to look at these examples and to see if they could tell us something, perhaps, about when we likely should trust science and when we might be warranted in being somewhat skeptical. So I begin with my favorite example, something known as the limited energy theory. Is anyone in the audience familiar with this history? Yes. Okay, all right, a couple of people, but in my experience, most people are not. And yet this was a very, very famous and powerful theory in the late 19th century, particularly in the United States, but it had a certain uptake in other places as well. The theory was that higher education damages women's reproductive capacity. The theory was first put forward by an American physician and Harvard University Medical School professor, Edward H. Clark. His book, Sex in Education, was published in 1873. It went through 19 editions, sold 12,000 copies, and was widely read, cited, and quoted in the United States at this time. The thesis that higher education causes female infertility. He wrote, higher education was destroying the reproductive functions of American women by overworking them at a critical time in their physiological development. The demands of higher education would cause their reproductive organs, their ovaries and uteri, to shrink. So to protect their fertility, women should not be subjected to the rigors of higher education. Now, what was this remarkable theory based on? Well, he said, quote, that it was a deduction from general scientific principles using certain auxiliary assumptions. So what were those general scientific principles? Well, the key one was the theory of thermodynamics. I know, it's a great story. Now, thermodynamics, of course, is one of the great scientific developments of the 19th century, and all of us who studied science, of course, learned the first law, the law of energy conservation, that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed or transferred. Therefore, Clarke deduced that energy directed towards one organ or physiological system, such as the brain or the nervous system, necessarily diverted it from another, such as the uterus, the reproductive, or the endocrine system. This was a deeply influential book, and like many things in the history of science, the timing was not coincidental. This was published just at the time when women's colleges were being established in the United States, including Vassar, the first women's college, 1861, Smith, 1871, Wellesley, 1875, and in his own midst in Cambridge, Radcliffe in 1879. M. Carey Thomas, who was the first dean and the second president of Bryn Mawr, another one of these women's colleges, later recalled, "We did not know when we began whether women's health could stand the strain of education." And this is a woman speaking. "We were haunted in those days by the clanging chains of that gloomy little specter, Dr. Edward H. Clarke, Sex and Education." Now, not everyone agreed with Clarke. Feminists signposted the obvious gender bias in the theory. One of them was Dr. Mary Putnam Jacoby, a professor of medicine at Columbia University and the author of more than 100 scientific papers. She attributed the popularity of the book to, quote, interests besides those of scientific truth, and pointed out the weak empirical basis of the work. So Clarke was implicitly invoking a hypothetical deductive model of science. And that model, of course, tells us that if you draw a deduction from a theory, then the follow-up is to test to see whether or not those deductions are true. So did Clarke have observational evidence to confirm his deduction? Well, he did, but it consisted of 7 cases of young women who had come to him for treatment, complaining of diverse problems, including menstrual pain, headaches, and mental illness. So we see immediately a very small size, a self-selected group, not randomized, so not meeting any of the standards of clinical trials that were already even beginning to emerge at that time. Now, he concluded they were all suffering from the effects of education and or employment based on his own judgment of their conditions. Jacoby said that this was empirically inadequate, so she undertook her own study with 268 women, ranging in health, education, and professional status. So she did as much as she could to create, it wasn't really randomized by modern standards, but a fuller, more representative sample, and she allowed the women to self-report their status and symptoms. She concluded that 59% of women had no or only slight suffering during menstruation, and the rest, if anything, and rest, if anything, was contraindicated. So exercise was actually better than resting. And she also noted that Clarke had offered no mechanism by which rest would aid fertility. So his argument was women had to rest, don't work so hard, don't expose yourself to the rigor and strain of study. But she found nothing in the nature of menstruation to imply the necessity or even the desirability of rest. So we can see that Jacoby and other feminists readily saw the social prejudice and empirical inadequacy of Clarke's theory. We can add to this in hindsight an obvious other problem, which is that the first law of thermodynamics refers to closed systems, and organisms are not closed systems. Moreover, there's one more that I like to point out. If the limited energy theory really was a deduction from a universal law of nature, then mustn't it apply also to men? So why didn't Clarke ask if men were educated, what part of their anatomy would shrink? My second example comes from my own work on the history of the rejection of continental drift. As some of you know, my first book was a detailed study of the robust debate that took place around the globe, here in Germany and France and England, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, India, a very wide-ranging debate over the theory of continental drift theory, which was first proposed here in Europe by Alfred Wegener. Wegener proposed that the continents are not fixed but move around the Earth, and that the interaction of moving continents could explain the major features of the globe and of Earth history that geologists were so keen to explain, such as earthquakes, mountains, volcanoes, and paleoclimate change. It could also explain the observed distribution of fossils and rock formations. So this theory, as I've already mentioned, most famously associated with Wegener, who was German but taught for many years in Austria. The Austrians have given him a stamp. You guys haven't done that yet, but you should. But he wasn't the only one. There are actually a variety of continental drift theories proposed and discussed at this time. But Wegener's was the most well-developed and the one which in hindsight is closest to what scientists believe today. But despite a robust discussion of a theory promoted by a famous and well-respected scientist, so Wegener was not a neglected genius, the theory was nevertheless rejected. About 40 years later, in the early 1960s, actually beginning in the late 50s, it was resurrected and accepted in the form of plate tectonic theory, which was slightly different in some ways, but the core idea, the idea of moving continents, is now considered an established and really indisputable scientific fact. In the 1970s, it became a truism among scientists that Earth scientists had in fact made a mistake by assuming the permanence of continents and oceans. And some even issued mea culpas. So for example, the MIT seismologist Frank Press, who later served as science advisor to President Jimmy Carter, wrote, "One of us, me, once wrote a paper dealing with the permanence of ocean basins. If he were allowed to expunge from the scientific record the one contribution that he regrets the most, this would be it." I think all academics should be allowed to expunge one paper, don't you think? It seems only fair. Now, so scientists were embarrassed. There was a sense of embarrassment in the scientific community about why they had rejected a theory that we now said was true. And so scientists came up with a rational reconstruction of the story, what appeared to be a rational explanation. And that was an alleged lack of a mechanism to explain continental drift. But in my PhD work, I showed that that explanation was wrong. In fact, in 2 days in the archive as a second-year graduate student, I found out that this was wrong. And that became sort of the beginning of this work, was how easy it was to show that the explanation scientists were giving was not correct. This very same mechanism that was accepted in the 1960s to explain plate tectonics, convection currents in the mantle, was proposed and discussed in the 1920s by the British geologist Arthur Holmes, a very famous, very prominent scientist. Nor can we say that continental drift was rejected for lack of evidence, because there was an extensive body of evidence that Wegener and others drew on from well-established scientific traditions, including stratigraphy, paleontology, structural geology, paleoclimatology, and these data were not collected by Wegener, but had been collected by other well-respected scientists over decades. And most of these data were accepted even at the time as factually correct. So the argument was never about whether the evidence was correct. The argument was about how to interpret that evidence. And indeed, much of this evidence came from the southern hemisphere, particularly the similarities between rocks and fossils in South Africa and South America. And for this reason, continental drift theory had much stronger support in South Africa, also in Australia, than it did in the northern hemisphere. So why was it rejected? Well, in my work, and in hindsight this seems to be becoming a theme, finding things where the rest of the world is on board and Americans are somehow being weird, but continental drift was particularly harshly rejected in the United States. In Europe, in France and Germany and England, it was much more sort of, well, maybe, we don't know, let's wait and see. But in the United States, it was rejected very, very strongly. Oh, thank you. Sorry, I actually have water, but that's good. I can use more. Thanks. So like most historical stories, there isn't just one reason. We can't say it was X, but there were a set of reasons that we can identify. And one of the important ones that I think is very interesting was an argument about scientific method, about what did it mean to do good scientific work. For example, the University of Chicago geologist Roland Chamberlain asked, can we call geology a science when it is possible for a theory like this to run wild? So many people in America saw continental drift theory as bad science. So why was that? And what did they think was necessary for geology to be called a science? Which is kind of a strange comment, too, when you think about actually geology was one of the most well-established sciences in Europe in the late 18th and 19th centuries, and was quite well-established, was one of the first sciences to receive federal government support in the United States. Well, American scientists were empiricists who thought the proper method of science was induction, and their hero was this man, Charles Darwin. They thought the appropriate stance for a scientific investigator was deductive, that the method was deductive, and that the stance should be one of modesty and humility, or at least that's what they said. So one of the key criticisms of Continental Drift theory was that it was deductive rather than inductive, and that Wegener himself was dogmatic, overconfident, and even auto-intoxicated. Bailey Willis, the Stanford professor, said the theory seemed to be, quote, written by an advocate rather than an impartial investigator. Joseph Singewald, a professor at Johns Hopkins, said that Wegener had set out to prove the theory rather than to test it. Edward Bailey, a professor at Johns Hopkins, explicitly invoked induction as the appropriate method of science. So he wrote, "My principal objection to the Wegener hypothesis rests on the author's method, which is not scientific, but takes the course of an initial idea, a selective search for corroborative evidence, and ends in a state of auto-intoxication in which the subjective idea comes to be considered objective fact." And Harry Fielding Reid, one of the founders of elastic rebound theory of earthquakes, said, "There have been many attempts to deduce the characteristics of Earth from a hypothesis, but they have all failed. This is another of the same type. Science has developed by the painstaking comparison of observations and through close induction by taking one short step backward to their cause, not by first guessing at the cause and then deducing the phenomenon." So explicitly rejecting the hypothetical deductive method and advocating instead induction. Now, when Reid says there have been many attempts of this type, when Berry says that Wegener is taking a familiar course, to what or whom are they referring? So that was one of my questions in this work. Well, who are they talking about? And I learned through my research that they were talking about Europeans. American geologists thought Europeans were guilty of what they called grand theorizing, and that this was bad science because it was deductive rather than inductive and ambitious rather than humble. Pierre Termier, the great French geologist who helped to develop the theory of alpine naps, was accused by Bailey Willis of being, quote, an authority. Well, why was that bad? Well, because he thought that, quote, young geologists cannot decline to accept his theory. So they associated grand theories, authorities with a kind of dogmatism, and they thought that that dogmatism was undemocratic. So in their writings, they explicitly linked the inductive method of science to American democracy. They wanted to develop what they called an anti-authoritarian scientific method. Sorry, what I call, that's my description of it, an anti-authoritative method, not only because they thought it was better for science, but because they thought it was more democratic and therefore better for America. And that Americans would in fact develop a better, more fact-based science to replace all the grand theorizing that Europeans had, in their view, wasted time on in the 19th century. So with very few exceptions in the United States, American geologists rejected the theory even though they acknowledged the considerable evidence that existed to support it. My third example is eugenics. Many of you know something about the history of eugenics, that it was founded in Britain by Francis Galton, the cousin of Charles Darwin, that it was meant to be a science of good genes, good inheritance, and good breeding. Galton was an advocate of what came to be called positive eugenics, to study human variability and inheritance with the goal of improving the human race, primarily by positive encouragement or positive incentives for fine people, good people, above average people, to have and raise many children. However, there were others who advocated what came to be known as negative eugenics, to prevent the less fit from breeding, to prevent race degeneration, and even race suicide. Now, I'm not going to talk about Germany here, or any of the very vexed and complicated questions about the relationships between eugenics and the Nazi period, but just to focus on the United States. In the US, eugenics was centered around a laboratory known as the Eugenics Record Office, based in Cold Spring Harbor, New York. This was mainstream science. It was funded by the Carnegie Institution of Washington, and field workers collected detailed information on families, which they recorded on index cards and analyzed for evidence of hereditary patterns. And so here you can see on the right the filing cabinets filled with index cards and then the sort of family trees that they would construct based on these data. They concluded that a whole variety of different human behavioral patterns and traits, including alcoholism, prostitution, criminality, gambling, feeble-mindedness, and even the tendency to go to sea, like to join the Navy or the Merchant Marine, were all inherited. Now, most historians and scientists would agree that this was a dark episode in the history of science. Advocates of negative eugenics promoted segregation of the so-called unfit in asylums to prevent them from breeding. 30 American states passed sterilization laws that permitted sterilization of the so-called unfit without their consent and sometimes without their knowledge. And tens of thousands of American citizens were sterilized, tens of thousands were sterilized in the United States and many more in Europe. And it was used in the United States in support of the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act in 1924, which restricted immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and entirely eliminated immigration from Asia on the basis of testimony from scientists about the eugenic basis for this. And of course, there was a strong connection between American eugenic research, American sterilization laws, and what later happened here in Germany. And that's been well documented by other people. Now, in the USA today, eugenics is often cited by critics of science, particularly on the political right, to suggest that science should not be trusted and that left-wing and progressive people are making a mistake because look at the history of eugenics. The screenwriter and novelist Michael Crichton likened contemporary calls for action to prevent climate change to earlier calls to prevent race suicide. In other words, trying to claim that climate change is a kind of fantasy of our own paranoid imagination. And he argued that since there was a scientific consensus on eugenics, we should now be skeptical of the scientific consensus on climate change. Now, there are many things wrong with that argument. Obviously, it's a logical fallacy because the fact that scientists were wrong about a particular matter in the past in no way tells us if a different group of scientists in a different time in a different place are wrong about an entirely different matter. So, I mean, it's a logically fallacious argument. But it does raise a question. Was there, in fact, a scientific consensus on eugenics? It's often claimed that there was. But I think it actually depends on how you define eugenics, and I want to argue that the answer to that question is actually no. Eugenics had three main elements. One was the claim that many traits, including complex ones like intelligence, are largely hereditable. We can identify that as a scientific claim. A second was the observation that these traits run in families and that this proves that they're genetic. That's also a scientific claim, but of a different sort. And then there's a third claim, which is that given the first and the second, it's appropriate and desirable to implement social policies to discourage procreation by those carrying undesirable hereditary traits. That's not a scientific claim, that's a political or a policy claim. Now, it is true that eugenic thinking was very widespread, but it is not true that there was a consensus on either the scientific or the political elements. And actually, when I first started this work, I thought for sure that we could show there was not a political consensus, but maybe there was a scientific consensus. But in fact, we can show that that's not true either. In fact, there was significant scientific criticism of both the scientific and the political elements, and it came from two main areas: social scientists and socialist biologists. So let's talk a little bit about the social scientists. Social scientists made the obvious logical point, which they continue to make today in arguments about nature and nurture, that just because traits run in a family does not prove that these are genetically controlled. Many of the ills recorded by eugenic record office field workers could also be explained by bad nutrition, bad education, bad linguistic skills or lack of linguistic skills, and discrimination in housing, education, and employment. So observation of disparate outcomes is not in itself proof of the cause of those outcomes. Many of the social scientists involved signposted the obvious class bias. So just as Mary Putnam Jacoby had signposted the obvious gender bias in Edward Clarke's work. We see a similar thing here. The language of race degeneration, well, this is particularly true in the United States. In the United States, if you talk about race degeneration, most people assume you're talking about the African Americans. But actually in the United States, the principal target of eugenic work was not actually African Americans. It was poor whites. It was a class-based thing, focused primarily on immigrants, particularly immigrants from Southern Europe, and in the United Kingdom, primarily focused on the working class. Immigrants and working class, of course, faced numerous obstacles, including outright discrimination in both the United States and England. Franz Boas, the great anthropologist, in 1916 explicitly made this point. He agreed that many traits, such as eye color, were inherited. Science had shown that. But other cases, he wrote, quote, "The determining influence on heredity is not so clear. We know that stature depends upon hereditary causes, but that it is also greatly influenced by more or less favorable conditions during the period of growth." And of course, height had been one of Galton's original things to measure, because Galton started with height because it's easy to measure, it's pretty unambiguous, and he showed that height ran in families. But Boas pointed out that we also know that if you don't feed children properly, they don't grow, and so height can also be related to nutrition. So Boas argued that the available science simply was not sufficient to sort out the genetic versus the environmental contributions for stature, and this was certainly true for more complex matters like intelligence. If we couldn't even do it for height, how could we possibly think we could do it for intelligence? Franz Boas's most famous student was Margaret Mead. In fact, it's a little known fact that Margaret Mead's master's degree dissertation was on the question of the IQ scores of children of immigrants. She showed that the IQ scores of these children varied according to family social status, the length of time they had been in the United States, and crucially, whether or not English was spoken at home. So let's move on. So Mead made the same argument, that there was clear evidence of correlations with social factors, and then until you took those into account, you could not make any claim about the genetic aspects. The other group that argued strongly against eugenics, both on scientific and political grounds, were socialist biologists, particularly in the United Kingdom. Numerous biologists objected to eugenics, but the ones who did so most strongly and clearly were those with socialist political views. And one of the most famous of them is the great geneticist J.B.S. Haldane. Haldane is known to the history of science as one of the founders of population genetics. And interestingly enough, Haldane was not unsympathetic to the idea of trying to improve the human race. In fact, he rather liked the idea. He thought the human race could stand improvement. But he thought that eugenics was problematic both scientifically and socially. Scientifically, because of the lack of understanding of the mechanisms of inheritance, particularly for complex traits, and socially because of the focus on the working classes, particularly with respect to sterilization and birth control, revealed the class prejudice involved. And one of the conspicuous features that he pointed out is that eugenicists were very strongly in favor of birth control and sterilization for the working classes, and yet denied birth control to upper class women who freely wanted it and fought for it. So he wrote, "Any legislation which does not propose to apply and is not actually applied, a very different thing, to all social classes alike, will probably be unjustly applied to the poor." And he insisted on the value and the dignity of the working class. And this comes out of his Marxist orientation, that he won't accept the assumption that the working class are less valuable than the middle classes or upper classes. And he wrote, "A man who can look after pigs or do any other steady work has a value to society, and we have no right whatever to prevent him from reproducing his like." The other famous biologist who spoke up at this time was Herman Mueller, who shared the Nobel Prize for work demonstrating that X-rays caused mutations in Drosophila. Mueller was the principal author of a manifesto written in 1939 called the Geneticist Manifesto. Interestingly enough, if you ask the question, why did these geneticists write this manifesto, it was a response to a question from the Science Service, which was a kind of science wire service for science news in the United States. The question was, quote, "How could the world's population be improved most effectively genetically?" So this question, the very framing of this question, does show how widespread eugenic thinking of one type or another was at this time. But Mueller wrote, the effective improvement of mankind is dependent upon major changes in social conditions and correlative changes in human attitudes. Eugenics was not the answer because, he said, there can be no valid basis for estimating, comparing the intrinsic worth of different individuals without economic and social conditions which provide approximately equal opportunities for all members of society, instead of stratifying them from birth into classes with widely different privileges. So really, in hindsight, the obvious complaint. And he continued and then he linked it, though, to the problems of capitalism. Because capitalist societies manifestly did not provide approximately equal opportunities for all, it was simply impossible to judge which outcomes were genetic and which were not. This was not a controlled experiment. Moreover, he noted, eugenicists were conspicuously asymmetric in their attention, focusing on the ills of the working class, yet ignoring the exact same traits when they occurred among the rich. So, for example, alcoholism in the rich they didn't worry about. Alcoholism in the poor, that was a sign of the unfitness of the poor. And the same for gambling and all kinds of other things. So he argued there can be no real advance without, quote, the removal of race prejudices and of the unscientific doctrine that good or bad genes are the monopoly of particular people or of persons with features of a given kind. My fourth example is hormonal birth control and depression. And I have 5 examples, but I think I'll just do 4 because we want to make sure to leave time for questions. In 2016, so last year, there was tremendous press fanfare in the United States over a new scientific study that concluded that hormonal contraception can cause depression. So here's just one example of an article. This was from the New York Times. Now, some doctors would say we already knew this. Women on the pill have experienced mood changes. Doctors have had patients self-report. Early scientific studies reported crying spells and irritability as side effects of the pill. And if you read the insert, the instructions that come with the pill in the United States, well, of course, if you're over 50, you can't read it anyway, but you need very good eyesight, but if you're over 50, you don't need to take the pill anyway. But if you can actually read this document, you will see that it tells you that side effects may include nervousness and depression. Indeed, when this newspaper report came out, my own daughter, who's now 26, asked me, how is this news? She knew that the pill could cause depression because I had told her that, because it had done that to me. So this story is a little personal. When I was in graduate school with no history of depression, no family history of depression, I suddenly became quite depressed for no apparent reason. I went to a counselor who was a woman, and she asked me if I were on the pill. In fact, I was, and I had recently changed the type of pill I was taking, and my depression had started just a few weeks later. She suggested I stop taking the pill. I took that advice, and within a few weeks I was completely back to normal, and I have never suffered depression since. Now, my experience can be dismissed as anecdotal. I prefer to view it as a study where n equals 1. But the more important point, working on a college campus, this therapist had seen many women who were on the pill, suffering depression, and who, when they stopped taking the pill, recovered. She also told me that the particular formulation I was taking was known to be more likely to cause depression than other formulations. And many women have had similar experiences. Indeed, the website healthline.com states that, quote, depression is the most common reason women give for stopping using birth control pills. So why did the media present this as a major new discovery? Well, they were reporting on a major new study, and it was a very good one. In fact, it was huge. It involved over 1 million women, so a really, really large sample. And it was done in Denmark, which, as some of you may know, has a comprehensive national database of healthcare. It's one of the best medical record systems in the world. In fact, it's really where the clearest evidence comes that vaccination doesn't cause autism, because they don't require vaccination in Denmark, but they do require doctors to keep track of who's been vaccinated. So if you are interested in medical health statistics, Denmark is a really good place to look. So the Harvard Gazette, the newspaper of Harvard University, sometimes thought to be the best university in the world, I don't necessarily think that's true, but no, I'm just kidding, described this study as important because, quote, because it was using hard data like diagnosis codes and prescription records rather than, quote, iffy methods like patient self-reporting. The author of the new study compared theirs with prior studies, stating that previously it had been, quote, impossible to draw any firm conclusions from the research on this subject. In other words, they concluded that prior to their study, we did not know whether or not the pill caused depression. But clearly some of us did know. My therapist did 30 years ago, and because of my experience, I knew. And the manufacturers of the pill knew because they put it in the patient information. So what was going on here? Well, to do a little history here, the evidence of the connection between the pill and depression has been known for as long as the pill has been on the market. In 1969, this was written up in detail in a popular book by an American journalist named Barbara Seaman, and it was called The Doctor's Case Against the Pill, because she was trying to make the point that doctors already knew in 1969 that the pill caused depression and other side effects. So although her work was inspired by self-reports from women, the book is based primarily on interviews with doctors, particularly psychiatrists. Chapter 15 focuses specifically on the question of depression, and it begins, psychiatrists were among the first doctors to persuade their own wives to stop using birth control pills. Finely tuned to emotional feedback, they did not take long to notice certain adverse reaction in their wives and daughters, patients, and friends. The effects that were most obvious ranged from suicidal and even murderous tendencies to increased irritability and tearfulness. A few pill users have become so hostile, suspicious, and delusional that they have seriously thought of murdering or have actually attempted to murder their own husbands and children. Others attempted to commit suicide, and some have succeeded. The book chronicled numerous cases of psychiatrists who had witnessed abrupt and significant mood changes in their patients after they went on the pill, and she suggested that psychiatrists were better placed to notice these changes than the gynecologists who were writing the prescriptions, since the former were trained to recognize mood disorders, and also because they tended to see their patients much more regularly. So a gynecologist might write a prescription and say, come back next year, but a psychiatrist was seeing his patients every week, or sometimes 2 or 3 times a week. Seaman also included testimony from women, including this one from the wife of a psychiatrist. This is my favorite. When I was on the pill, I hardly ever got off the couch except to slap the children. But Seaman's work was also supported by evidence from clinical trials. It wasn't just case reports. And many of these clinical trials did report some evidence of psychiatric effects. But there are a relatively small number of studies, especially when you consider the hundreds of millions of women who have taken the pill over the half-century that it's been on the market. A PubMed search on hormonal birth control and depression or mood disorders and a few other keyword changes revealed a total of 27 studies. So this is actually a very small number of studies considering the significance of this drug. Interestingly enough, most of these studies rely on self-reporting. Depression and mood changes are feelings, which admittedly can be hard to pin down. And they can't be measured in the way that, say, blood sugar or blood pressure can be. So they are harder things to diagnose. But consider this one additional piece of evidence. In 2016, so the same year as the big Danish study came out, a study of male hormonal contraception injection found that more than 20% of the subjects reported mood changes. One developed severe depression, and another attempted to commit suicide. And because of these adverse effects, the study was stopped, even though the rate of pregnancy suppression was greater than 98%. Here's how the study authors described their results. The study regimen led to near complete and reversible suppression of spermatogenesis. So this is like the perfect birth control pill, or birth control, right? It works and it's reversible. But the frequency of mild to moderate mood disorders were relatively high. The study showed that hormonal contraception caused depression in men. And consider this, the results were measured through self-reporting, the very technique that was deemed too iffy to demonstrate in women was the basis of stopping the same kind of study when it happened in men. Now, we all know that correlation is not by itself proof of causation, so it is important when we find correlations to ask about potential causal mechanisms. So here we can say, is there a known mechanism that could explain why hormonal contraception causes depression in both men and women? And the answer to that question is yes. High levels of reproductive hormones, including estrogen and progestin, have been shown to lower brain serotonin levels by increasing the concentration of a brain enzyme that reduces serotonin. And as most people know, low levels of serotonin are linked to depression. And conversely, many antidepressant drugs work by interfering with serotonin reuptake. And interestingly enough, one of the side effects of antidepressant drugs is reduced libido. So there's clearly a relationship between depression and reproductive function. So to sum up, we have 50 years of self-reporting by women and their doctors that the pill can cause depression. We have the experience and case reports of psychiatrists and therapists. We have numerous small studies that did find effects. We have a study that was taken as proving the exact same effect in men. And we have a mechanism that explains how all these things could occur. So why did it take until 2016 for scientists to conclude that we knew that the pill can cause depression in women? Well, let's look again at that Harvard Gazette report of the study. That report told us that previous studies had lacked hard data, that they were based on iffy techniques like self-reporting and recall. But the new study was based on hard data like, quote, diagnostic codes and prescription records. So think about that for a minute. The judgments of health professionals are being taken as facts, whereas the experience of patients are not being taken as facts, or at least not when the patients are female. So what we see is that evidence was ignored because it was not of a preferred type. Evidence was ignored when it came from women, but the same type of evidence accepted when it came from men. So I would say that this is an example of what I call scientists playing dumb, discounting evidence because it didn't meet a certain methodological standard. Lacking conclusive evidence that hormonal contraceptive can cause mood changes, they concluded that we could not say that it does. But this is a classic type 2 error. They missed an effect that was really there. Now, my last example is dental floss, but it's getting late, so I think that I'm going to skip that because I want to make sure we have time for questions. So I will fast forward to the conclusion of my talk. But if you are interested in dental floss, how many of you heard the reports about how it doesn't work, isn't good? So that's wrong. Dental floss is good and it does work. And if you want to know more about that, you can ask me. Okay. And it's cheap, you know. Okay, so let's go on to the discussion of these studies. So one of the things I'm interested in as a historian, as historians we're very sensitive to the differences between cases, places, time, and space. But history of science is a kind of interesting field of history because if we're interested in science as an activity, then it is relevant to ask, well, do these cases have anything in common? Can we learn anything from them? And one very obvious conspicuous thing about all of these cases is that in every single case there was no consensus. If we look at the limit in energy theory, we saw that female physicians objected to the theory and provided empirical evidence and theoretical grounds to question it. If we look at continental drift, we find that outside the United States, the theory was supported by many geologists, and a few in America as well. We look closely at the opposition to eugenics by social scientists and socialist biologists, and in the case of the pill, we saw that psychiatrists had been reporting on depression of the pill going back to the 1960s, even where gynecologists and other physicians were dismissing it. So one of the things I think the history of science shows is that scientific consensus is actually quite hard to come by. And so one of the first things we can do in any debate is simply to ask the question, is there a scientific consensus or not? If there is, then I think we may conclude that it is reasonable to accept that consensus. But if there isn't, then that is an invitation to look more closely at what's going on. It doesn't mean that the debate is necessarily a political debate. There can be good scientific reasons why scientists disagree, but there can also be social, political, and ideological reasons as well. If there is a consensus, then it suggests that any debate that may be taking place is probably primarily not about the science, but about something else. And then we need to attend to who is debating. And this is one of the conclusions that came out of our work on Merchants of Doubt. We need to look at expertise, because if a nuclear physicist is telling us that smoking doesn't cause cancer, or a rocket scientist is telling us that smoking doesn't count, that should set off a little alarm bell in our heads. Or if an actress tells us that vaccines cause autism, that should raise a red flag. Now, I want to be very clear. I'm not saying that non-scientific debate is illegitimate. People may have all kinds of good reasons to question certain kinds of scientific or science-related claims. So, for example, people may have valid culinary or political reasons to avoid genetically modified food, or religious reasons to decline vaccinations. But these are very different matters, both intellectually and socially, from whether or not organic foods are healthier to eat, or whether vaccines cause autism. What I want to argue is illegitimate is to camouflage a political debate as a scientific one, which is what the climate change denial story is all about. My second conclusion is that epistemic matters can go badly when evidence is ignored or discounted. In the limited energy theory, the obvious thing that was being discounted were the thousands of American women who were going to American colleges at this time who were not sick, weak, or infertile. In fact, no one ever actually did a comprehensive study of the thousands of women who were pursuing higher degrees to see whether or not their fertility was affected. In the case of Continental Drift, we see that American scientists are essentially discounting all of the evidence in favor of an argument about methodology. In the case of eugenics, we see clearly a neglect of evidence from the social sciences, but also a neglect of evidence from the natural sciences on the complexities of inheritance. In the case of the pill, we saw how case reports, women's experiences, and various small clinical studies were all ignored. So why was this evidence ignored or discounted? Why would good scientists ignore evidence? Well, I think there is a pattern that we see in these cases and many other that have to do with methodological commitments. Now, all scientists have methodological commitments. You can't be a scientist or do science without choosing your methods, and those choices often involve beliefs about what kinds of methods are better, more powerful, more persuasive, or just more interesting to use. I mean, in my own experience as a geologist, most people who become field geologists because they like being outside. People who prefer working in the laboratory are usually people who like tinkering with machines and glassware and find it satisfying to do that kind of work. So all scientists have methodological commitments. A methodological commitment is not a wrong thing per se, but it can become a problem when it becomes a kind of fetish. And I think that what we see in the Continental Drift story is a kind of methodological fetishism, where scientists rejected evidence a priori because it didn't meet their methodological standards. And that's the same story as we see in the case of the pill, when scientists dismiss case reports and women's self-reporting as iffy, and yet accept diagnostic codes as, quote, hard data. We saw that geologists ignored a world of data because of their commitment to inductive method, and proponents of the pill ignored women who were suicidal or even homicidal because they privileged epidemiology over clinical practice and dismissed the experience of patients. Conclusion 3, then, a good deal of evidence is imperfect, but that's no reason to ignore it. Just because evidence is iffy doesn't mean it isn't evidence. So that leads then to a meta-conclusion, which is about humility. And here I think a lot about the work of Pierre Duhem and his arguments going back to the very start of the 20th century about the importance of humility in interpreting scientific results. Now, Duhem is most famous to historians and philosophers, as well as postmodernists, for his contribution to what became known in hindsight as the Duhem-Quine thesis, the idea that scientific theories are underdetermined by their evidence, that scientific evidence alone is insufficient to tell us what theory we should believe, and this has opened, this argument opened the door to a whole host of complicated discussions in the 20th century about the validity and reliability of scientific knowledge. But the interesting thing about Duhem is that he did not take his own holistic view of science as grounds for radical skepticism. What he took it for was grounds for healthy humility. And I want to say that I think he was right about humility. The challenges of science are not warrant for corrosive skepticism, but they are grounds for self-awareness about the limits of our practices. They offer an argument against being dogmatic, and certainly against being fetishistic about methodological standards. Now, many scientists think they make their science stronger by being strict about method, but I think the history of science suggests that the opposite may be true. And finally, one other point. Most scientists believe that science is and needs to be value neutral, but the history of science, if we look at the socialist biologists who opposed eugenics, if we look at the feminists who pointed out the errors in the limited energy theory, we can come to the conclusion that history of science supports the view that values may in fact play a positive role by helping scientists to see the flaws in other people's claims. And this is a point that the philosopher Helen Longino has developed at great length. So this supports the argument for diversity in science for epistemic as well as its social benefits. Thank you very much. No pressure there.
No, the floor is open for questions. So I don't see any hand up. So I'm asking the first question. So you were talking about methodological fetishism, as you call it. You did not mention theoretical fetishism. So did this play a role as well?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, certainly scientists can become very committed to their theories, and it's sort of over.
Well, in sociology, they usually are.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and of course, I haven't studied the history of sociology. I guess in the cases I've looked and studied, what I feel and what I've seen it is that I'm always interested when scientists get emotional, because they think they're not supposed to. So if they do, it tells you something's going on. And what I see in all of these cases is that it seems like the scientists get most emotional and most stressed when it's about a methodological question. And so that's why it seems to me that this is tapping into some kind of, really deep, it's a meta commitment, right? I mean, because if you think about it, as a scientist, you can be committed to a theory, or you can be committed to a set of theories, or you can be theoretically agnostic. But when you commit to methodology, you think that methodology should apply across everything. And so that can, in some ways, I think, be even a more powerful bias, if you want to use that word, or blinder, than your theoretical view. And this particularly did come up in the Continental Drift debate. Very few American scientists say, we don't like Continental Drift because we prefer the theory of collapsing continents, or we prefer the theory of permanence of oceans. They said, this isn't science. And I thought that was very revelatory, and so that was what invited me to try to look more deeply into why they said that.
I'm going to watch my students.
Yeah.
More emotional.
There you go. Yeah. But you may well be right. I mean, there may be an additional argument about theoretical fetishism as well.
So,
yeah.
I agree totally with the normative implications, but I doubt whether they will improve the situation for the sciences and the question of public trust. Because you pointed out to many flaws in the course of science, but there are other areas where there is no controversy in science and still there is no trust. And if you listen to Greenpeace, they say, well, always make a scientific arguments, but when the scientists begin to argue, make another argument. Never talk to the scientists. And the social movements that are critical of science, they would like to exploit controversy in science. But who can really say there is a controversy? The activists say we can say it. But if you look into the details of negotiations or discourse or consensus conferences, you find out that only the scientists can say that there is a controversy in science. And if the activists don't find a controversy in science, they change the argument. So it's no longer the risks of GMO, but it's the involvement of Monsanto. Yeah, and this involvement in Monsanto is then framed in terms of unknown risks and uncertainties. And if the scientists begin to compare the unknown risks of GMOs with the unknown risks of conventionally bred, then again they shift the argument. Yeah, and the distrust of science is a different, it's like the populism of Trump. Yeah? You have a real bad feeling about the elites, and you want to find something, and the promises of technological progress, which relies on non-controversial science, the progress, these promises are felt to have bad consequences, and so you direct the distrust against science. And I mean, distrust, of course, is a democratic right.
Right.
And it's very difficult to say you must not, you must trust.
Right.
So.
Yeah, well, that's a great comment, and I agree with all of your points. I mean, I think that was part of the thrust of our work, Emergence of Doubt, which was to say that many of these controversies, in fact, all of the ones we study in that book, are not really about the science. None of these issues, acid rain, the ozone hole, climate change, none of those issues were considered controversial by the scientists involved. But they were made to be controversial because of a set of political and social commitments and economic interests. So there's no question, I think one of the things that we learned writing Emergence of Doubt, and I hope that our readers take away from it, is that it's actually quite easy to create a controversy, a political controversy, if you're motivated. And as you say, one way you do it is by shifting the argument, changing the terms of the debate. You know, you lose one element, so you shift. And there's no question that people do that. I think you're absolutely right. I guess the other thing I would say in terms of what I'm trying to achieve here, and obviously one of the things that's been interesting for me in my work, I'm in this very strange position that bad news for the world is good for my career. So every time something happens bad, I get more invitations to try to explain it. And so the election of Donald Trump, of course, led to a huge proliferation of invitations about this issue of trust and expertise. But I think it's really important not to lump too many different things together. So there are a lot of different reasons why Donald Trump got elected, but it's important to remember, I think, a couple of things. Number one is the majority of the American people did not vote for him. I mean, he got elected because we have this rather peculiar electoral system where a minority of people can determine the outcome. And the Republican Party has exploited that very, very effectively, not just in this election, but in the last 20 to 25 years. And the Democrats have not actually been smart about response. So that's one thing. So, it's not to say that it justifies Donald Trump, but it is important to realize that, the majority of Americans didn't vote for him. But the second thing is that after the election, many people said, well, this is about the rejection of expertise. Trump voters hate the elite, they hate university professors, and it was linked to Brexit, where there was also a certain amount of what seemed to be anti-elitist sentiment. But if you look at the opinion polls in the United States, what they show is that the vast majority of people still respect science and still respect scientific elites. And as I said in the beginning, only reject certain specific scientific claims that they see as at odds with their worldview. So that tells you actually something about some potential remedies, at least in some cases. And I'm not saying this is going to work for everyone. But, I work with the National Center for Science Education in the United States, where we work a lot with school teachers. Because one of the real problems we have in the United States is the political pressure that is brought to bear on school teachers, who are very, very vulnerable. And if they're pressured not to teach evolutionary biology or to teach both sides, that's very difficult for them. So one of the things we found, though, is that if you sit down with people and you say, look, I understand that one of the reasons that people in your community may be upset about evolutionary theory is that they feel that it means that their life is meaningless and has no purpose. But actually, there are many great theorists who have addressed that question, including many religious leaders, including the Pope, if you're in a Catholic community, including many Protestant leaders, and including many scientists who are themselves religious people. And so we found that if we can give people information, for example, there's a fantastic evolutionary biologist at Brown University, Ken Miller, who's also a religious Christian, and he talks about this issue. And we found that if you give this to teachers and school children, and he talks about how he can be a scientist and a Christian, and how he loves evolutionary biology, and it doesn't make him feel like his life has no meaning, that actually this is very effective for a certain group of people. So understanding some of the nuances of the problem, I think, can give you some insights into possible corrections. And you might say, well, okay, but that's so small and this problem is so big. And that's true, except that in places like Wisconsin, the margin of the vote was something like, I think it was 10 or 15,000 people. I mean, it's actually a pretty small number of people. So if you could get into those communities, I mean, I've spoken to more than 15,000 people just in my public lectures in the last decade. So, I mean, if you could reach those people, you could reach half of those 10,000 people or their children, I think you can actually affect change. At least I have to believe that, because if I don't, then I don't know, then I have to move to Antarctica or something, So.
Okay. My question is, what influence do big chemical companies have on the statements of what is true or what is wrong with science? They may have a materialistic gain when they produce certain things which parts are not so good, or they may have problems when they produce better things and these things don't sell so well. So what is your opinion about this?
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is a very important question as well. So I didn't talk in this presentation at all about private sector funding of science, corporate research. That's another whole issue, a very important one. And one of the challenges we face today is that a tremendous amount of supposedly academic research is funded by the private sector. And sometimes it's funded in ways that I think preserve the integrity, the independence of academic research, and sometimes it's funded in ways that aren't. And we know that this happened very extensively with the tobacco industry, and we know that it's happening to a good extent in the United States, in the chemical industry, the pharmaceutical industry. And I think this is a huge problem, because if the science is being influenced or manipulated or biased or otherwise conditioned by the interests of funders, then the science may be compromised, and that is a huge basis for legitimate distrust. And so I think the scientific community needs to take on board a much greater level of self-awareness and disclosure about these issues, because at least in the United States, the scientific community wants to have it both ways. They want to say, you should trust us, science is great, we're honest, all our work is peer-reviewed, this is all great, and yet we know that there's all kinds of malfeasance that has taken place. Again, as I said, particularly, it's very well documented from tobacco, but we have evidence that this is going on in other areas as well. And when the public hears that, they say, well, that is a basis for distrust. Why should I trust you when we know that you're being funded by Monsanto, let's say? And so I think there are protections and safeguards that universities could put in place, but very few have. And so I do think that this is an area that people need to look at much more closely, but it's not what I'm working on specifically in terms of my own work, although I have written a little bit about disclosure and why this is one of the reasons that, like, some scientists will say, oh, it doesn't matter who funds my work, I'm objective, right? I mean, this is a kind of contemporary cluelessness, right? Because we know that that's not, you're not objective just because you declare that you are, right? That's not a credible position, and yet many scientists do take that position. So I think the scientific community needs to become much more educated on this issue and think through a better set of responses.
So we stay on the left side for a moment, and then we talk on the right side. Sorry.
Yes.
Good to stand up.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much for the very thrilling and informative lecture. I had a question regarding your last comment, your demand, if I could call it that way, that we need more diversification in academics. And I was wondering, is that really possible? Because if we take Max Weber, for example, and his, even though criticized Werturteilsfreiheit, there may be still some truth to it, namely that what field we choose to study is actually never objective. It cannot be. Mm-hmm. And now my question is, isn't it a problem that all the professors, all the scholars that go through the institutions, that they develop a certain habitus, and especially develop a class-related perspective on the world. And isn't that a problem now that we experience that the studies of these scholars are somehow very much not objective regarding the concerns of the people, and maybe that is the root of some disagreement that we experience, especially in the United States. So I'm very interested in your opinion on that.
Yeah, that's a very profound, important question. I agree with you completely. I mean, we know that there are certain sorts of social structures that reinforce patterns of thought, right, habitus and such like, so that even if you bring people into your community who have come from somewhere else, it doesn't necessarily mean that they retain a different perspective as they're enculturated into the community. But that said, and that final slide, the final couple of slides there is actually, I mean, I'm always struggling with, these are very complicated issues, but I'm trying to make an intervention that could be useful. So I have a whole second lecture that draws very heavily on Helen Longino's work and looks more deeply at this question of diversity and its epistemic value. But I think we do have evidence that it helps. You know, it may not cure the problem completely, but if you look at an institution, I mean, particularly someplace like Harvard, where I teach now, after many years of teaching in a public university, you know, Harvard is a very different institution today than it was even 30 years ago. And a lot of that is because of a conscious decision that was made by the administration to diversify the institution in terms of gender, in terms of race, and less so, but to a certain extent in terms of class as well. And particularly, you know, when you're in the archives and you're reading materials, you know, it is a different place now than it once was. And I think this is true in much of American academic life. So there is still obviously a very heavy preponderance of middle and upper class white people, but there are a lot more women than there once were. There are some more people of color, and that's changing pretty rapidly in many institutions. And I think you do see changes. I mean, I've seen it in my own life, the way certain assumptions, things that were taken for granted in academic departments 30 years ago that now at least would be questioned. Whether it would be fully changed, it may not be, but it would be at least questioned a bit. The main thing I would say about the United States has to do with class. And it's one reason why I find the eugenics argument so interesting. So much of American cultural discussion since the 1960s has been focused on race and gender, and we've defined our diversity problems and our social stratification problems very much in terms of racial, ethnic, and gender identity. And even now, if you look at, say, the fight that's going on, I mean, why did Donald Trump decide to pick a fight about transgendered people in the military? I mean, the number of transgendered people serving in the military must be a very small number, but he chooses to make this an argument because he knows that gender issues are a hot button issue for people. But the issue that we don't discuss in the United States is class. And, you know, I think that's very much tied to the legacy of anti-communism, the legacy of the rejection of Marxism, even as a theoretical construct, even if not as a political system in the United States, and the myth of America as a classless society. And so it's hard to get an engaged conversation about that in the United States. But you do see it in some places. So I think that's the big missing piece in a lot of American analysis. And in a way, it's one of the harder things to remedy because, you know, if you look at what American universities have done, and not just universities, also, you know, businesses, the law profession, medicine. I mean, half of all doctors in the United States are women now. Certain professions have managed to bring women in actually quite rapidly because it turns out middle-class women don't necessarily have incredibly radically different views than the middle-class men that they're married to, or brothers or sisters or whatever. So the assimilation of women seems to have been an easier thing for many institutions than the assimilation of people of color or people of more working-class backgrounds. So I think there is a real issue to be said there. One last thing, and then I'll move on. All of that said, though, if you look at Londa Scheibinger's work on feminism in science, I mean, she argues very strongly that bringing women into science has made an enormous difference. And she has specific cases where she argues theoretical frameworks that got challenged and changed, empirical evidence that was brought to bear that had been previously ignored. So she has a very compelling case that feminism, bringing women into science, has made an enormous difference. So then the question would be, you know, do you agree with her arguments. I don't think it's always compelling, but I think she's got a pretty strong case. And then how could you do that for the tougher tasks that have to do with race and class?
Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry, but I really want to get back to the question of remedies, actually, because I was wondering. So I'm in my own work. I'm working on public opinion and the populist vote, actually, and I had a curious situation where a couple of months ago I had a couple of scientists, people who work on climate change, really what we call like hard science, came to me and they were doing a tour and doing research because they got worried of the Trump vote and different things we saw in politics over the past years, and they all of a sudden were wondering, do we miss something? Do we have to change? What should we do? Etc., etc. And I was a little bit overwhelmed by the question because I wasn't at all prepared for that. And I gave them probably a very, very short answer. And it had to do with, well, do what you do best and then maybe try to think to be a bit more transparent or outward going and, engaging to discussions and exchange with people who are not so familiar with scientific standards, etc., etc. But while listening to you and also listening to your comment, I was all of a sudden wondering, was I wrong? Like, maybe if you make the argument that, from what I got, is that, well, there is no way to win that sort of game because there are different actors and different set of rules, right? So is transparency actually a solution? Like, if these type of people come to you, you say, engage more?
Okay, so yes and no. It's a really good question. So the short answer is no, transparency is not a solution. And what's wrong with that answer, if I may, since you invited it, is it's implying that the fault is with the science and the scientists, that they haven't been sufficiently transparent, or at least maybe you didn't do that personally, but I mean, I've certainly seen this happen where, the scientific community would start saying, well, what have we done wrong? We're being attacked by climate deniers. American people don't accept our science. We must have done something wrong. We need to be more transparent, or we need to, there's different ways people respond. Some people say a lot of the scientific community has said we have to narrow the uncertainties. Like, a lot of the scientific community has, in my opinion, misdiagnosed the problem because climate deniers exploit scientific uncertainty as a political strategy. Scientists think that means that if they could just narrow the uncertainties and, instead of saying it's, the climate sensitivity is between 1.5 and 4 degrees, if we can say it's between 2 and 3, that will somehow solve the problem. That's a misdiagnosis, and I don't think that will work. But on the flip side, so there's sort of a couple of different things going on. The rejection of climate science is largely political and economic. Fossil fuel companies don't want to give up the most profitable product in the history of mankind, and a lot of Americans don't want to give up what they view as a very wonderful way of life, a comfortable way of life. And they associate climate change with the idea that Americans will have to have a reduced standard of living. Those concerns don't get addressed just by scientists being more transparent, right? But at the same time, we do have evidence to show that when scientists get out of the ivory tower and meet people and talk to them and are human beings, then when the right wing accuses them of, being part of some global conspiracy or, being elitist or being whatever, those accusations have less force because people have met scientists, people have talked to scientists. So in that sense, if by transparency you mean like being more open about, your methodological techniques, I don't think for most people that's very meaningful, and I don't think like a clearer statistical analysis is going to affect. But if by transparent you mean being engaged, being accessible, then I think, yes, I think we have evidence. And one of the ways I think about this is it's a kind of a fortiori argument. Transparency, accessibility, good communication, clear slides, not baffling people with, those are all good things. And so we should do them because they're good things, and they may help, but they're not a substitute for acknowledging and identifying the political component of the problem, which ultimately has to be addressed in political ways, I think.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alexander Geppert, and were you. 2 questions, back to your paper. The first one is by the way, I'm very sorry to have missed the part on on dental flossing, because this is something that I experience every day. But the first question
You're right, it's a more personal one. Maybe I'll have to leave out a different example next time.
the first question is, I was very interested in your collection of cases of wrong sciences. Can you think of an example of a science that was considered true at some point, was then debunked, and went sort of back to the good side? I mean, is it possible for a particular type of science to kind of be completely out of fashion and then come back and have a kind of renaissance? That's my question number one. And the second question is, I was trying to find sciences that for which your conclusions might be almost accurate, but that still sort of do something different. For instance, if you think of ufology, ufologists would claim that they use a broad set of methodological tools. They would say that they don't have a methodological commitment. They would say that they found all kinds of evidence, still they fail to reach a consensus. What is it if you take ufology as an example, that is different when you compare them to the sciences that you sort of looked at? Because in those cases, in the end, it all turned out to be wrong. But this is something that ufologists would claim is not the case. So is there something fundamentally different with ufology than with the three sort of...
I'm sorry, morphology? What
ufology, believe in UFOs?
Oh, ufology.
How does ufology sort of fit in these sort of examples of sciences that have sort of very broad tools of methodological sets, but still they have not reached consensus?
Yeah, well, okay, I think I may have to punt on the UFO question, only because I guess I would argue, drawing on a sociological definition of science, that UFOlogy is not a science. That's a collection of people, it's a hobby, or it's a cultural movement. I mean, it's something, but I would say it's not a science. It doesn't have any of the institutional markers of science. It doesn't participate in the institutional social structures of science. So that would be, but if you're interested in that problem, Michael Gordon at Princeton has been doing, I know his work, so he would be the person to go to with that question. I'm sorry, can you remind me what the first one was?
Your collection of sort of science cases.
And debunking. Right, well, of course. I mean, this is one of the challenges of history of science. And when I wrote my first book in the introduction, I said something which I still think is true, that one of the central questions of history of science is this. We, in the modern Western European and North African, or global North, however you want to characterize it, generally accept science as a source of warranted knowledge. We take the findings of science, we assume them to be essentially true, and we teach them in schools. But we know from history that some of these facts and theories that we accept today as true will be overturned in the future. We know that. Larry Loudon, some years ago, the philosopher, called it the pessimistic meta-induction, right? That given that we've seen so many things in the past change, we could conclude that everything we believe now will be overturned eventually. So that's a very complicated question. There's a lot of literature on it, because then it leads to this question of, are things overturned? Are they debunked? Are they adjusted? Are parts of the theories, go forward where other parts? And of course, Kuhn, in his Structure of Scientific Revolutions, presented a very radical view of a sort of total wholesale rejection and then a complete replacement with something totally new. And that view, of course, was very exciting to some people because they thought that was a much more exciting vision of what science was like. It was also very upsetting to a lot of people because it seemed to imply a kind of irrationality, if not irrationality, because now we're saying that what we used to think is totally wrong. And of course, very few scientists accepted the incommensurability thesis, right? And a lot of philosophers didn't either. And so scientists made all kinds of moves to say, well, here's how you solve that. For example, the famous one would be in physics, where Kuhn would say relativistic physics totally overturns Newtonian mechanics. Time and space used to be absolute, now they're relative, so even the words time and space refer now to different things. And this is why Kuhn could make claims like saying that the world has changed. Time is not the same as it was before. That's a pretty radical claim. Of course, the physicists reject that. They say, oh, that's not true. Newtonian mechanics is still true, It's the special case where speed is not very fast relative to the speed of light. So now Newtonian mechanics gets subsumed as a special case under the larger, but it's still, quote, true. So that's one move people make. Another move are the structural realists in philosophy who will say, well, F equals ma. We might have a different conception of what force is going forward. John Dupre, the philosopher, is doing a big project on energetics, where he's going back to some ideas of Ostwald and saying, we might in the future have a different idea of force, which would be more of an energeticist rather than materialist view. But the structural realists would say, well, that could be true, but the equation F equals ma will still stand. And there'll still be some structure in the universe that is accurately captured. So there's some piece of it. Now, I don't know which, if any, of these views are correct or not. I think there are really plausible and important arguments on both sides. So, it's a very big question. I'll just give you one more example, though. You can tell I'm an empiricist because I like to answer questions with examples. The question of epigenetics. In genetics, are you following this? So, Lysenko was famously discredited and blamed for tremendous ills in the Soviet Union, and Soviet scientists who believed in genetics were sent to jail. I mean, it's a bad period, it's a bad story. And I think there's not much question that Lysenko himself was, at best, a really bad scientist with very limited, making a very big theory on very limited amounts of data. At worst, he was a charlatan. So, again, there's big arguments about that. But some people want to say now that epigenetics, in which we have evidence that the genetic material of an organism can be influenced, that gene response can be influenced by the environment, that means that Lysenko was right, that he was debunked and now he's right. Well, very few scientists would agree with that, because there are all kinds of reasons why Lysenko wasn't right. But you could say there's a kernel of his argument about the role of the environment that is right, but then again, you can also argue, but lots of people said that. I mean, Lysenko was not alone in making that argument. So to the extent that current epigenetics returns attention back to the environment, you could say that's a kind of going back, or you could say it's a kind of recovery, or you could say that biologists in the 20th century, I guess this would be what I'd say, I think this gets back to the fetishist thing, biologists in the mid-century got so excited about genetics that they really ran with genetic explanations of all kinds of things and really pushed incredibly hard on the genetic component in a kind of exclusionary way. So maybe this is a theoretical fetishism, right? It's all, master narrative, DNA controls RNA, which controls protein synthesis, and that's all we need to know. And there were other people saying, well, but wait, there are these other interesting things, and those got sort of brushed aside. So I think there are lots of examples in history of science where we can see that. Something gets brushed aside in the excitement or the fetishism of a new theory or a certain method, and then later on people say, hold on, can we recover that? There was something there that was valuable. So that's how I view it. It's not so much a debunking as maybe more like a recovery. Yeah.
So I see 4 more questions. Is this okay?
Yeah, I would say I am feeling a little tired. Could we do maybe like 2 more? Would that be all right?
Oh, okay.
Okay.
So this is a hard decision on my side.
Oh, no, okay.
Thank you for your presentation and
You're welcome.
wonderful examples. I understand as a historian of science that you like Duhem and the humility that you learn from him. I mean, historians learn to have humility because science is a process and goes and self-corrects and all that. But I wonder if in the current political climate, not just in Europe with populism, but also in the United States, if this humility is really the right answer, because we are situated in a context that doesn't show humility to science. So in a way, when you said at the beginning, the climate change, this is not really a epistemological question, that's a political question. I wonder if we wouldn't get a little bit further if we would have something like comparative epistemologies or something, because religion traditionally was very sure about its truth. And those who believe are still very sure about their truth. So it is different truth questions. And if people on a wider scale would understand what actually is considered truth in one area and considered truth in another area, science, for example, then maybe, I mean, I'm very skeptical about that, but maybe we could get into a discussion on a different level that would understand actually that science is humility by performance, because it corrects its wrong results. Whereas the true believers are show non-humility because, I mean, or maybe over a very long time. I mean, Galileo was then taken off the index in the 20th century, so that happens too.
Religion is self-correcting, it just takes a little longer.
Yeah, but you understand my question.
Yeah, no, I do. It's a very interesting thought. I'm not sure I have too much to say, and maybe if I keep my answer short, we can have more questions, but it's definitely worth considering, and also because there's also the problem of, yeah, maybe I'll just leave it at that. It's a good idea, I'll think about it. Thank you. Could I possibly get a little more water?
Perhaps we should be more modest in our semantics. To speak about truth is a very complex issue. And one of the problems I think we have, that since we have so much to discuss and to present to the public, we tend to be very early and very rapid to take facts and the beginning of evidence as something like truth. And it would be more modest to be very careful. Even our discussion on truth is probably a wrong one. We should talk minimum, or we should maximum talk about evidence, gaining evidence. And the point I would like to make is that we're also falling in a trap in presenting results more than we take the pain of presenting how we came to the question, and dare again to talk about the process and the complexity of what's going on, about our doubts and things like that, in order to gain authenticity, I think is the point we should be very careful. And this would help then also to communicate with the people.
Yes.
We should stop trying to educate them and teach. We should rather try to engage them. And public engagement is something completely different from what we tend to talk now about with buzzwords like public science. This is completely different. Public engagement is something which is very serious, and we must learn to go back to show our doubts and complexity. Would you believe that this would help, or would it increase uncertainty where people tend to wait for clear answers and short answers?
Yeah. No, I totally agree with the public engagement argument. I think that's exactly right, and I think this relates back to your question. I think a genuine public engagement where people really, where scientists really take seriously the concerns and the anxieties of people, including, for example, I mean, one of the reasons why I'm a big admirer of Ken Miller is that he takes seriously this anxiety that many people feel that evolutionary biology means that your life is meaningless. And if you take that seriously, then you come to the table with a very different attitude than if you come to the table saying, I'm going to prove to you that humans are no different than bugs and we all evolved by the exact same process, blah, blah, blah. So I totally agree. I think it's a very different view. One of my personal heroes is Michael Faraday, who used to do these fantastic public lectures at the Royal Institution, and hundreds and hundreds of people would come to see Faraday's demonstrations because he loved what he did, and he conveyed that, and it was exciting, and he had fun experiments. And, I don't know any modern scientist who does anything even remotely close to that. So I think there are some interesting models in the history of science that we could, go back and recover elements of. Obviously, we're not going to recreate the Royal Institution in the 1890s, but there are elements of that I think we could learn from. So I totally agree with that. I also totally agree with your point about explaining how we come to our findings. And actually, I've made that argument in many places, and that's actually the basis of my TED Talk, which in the United States has 1 million views, although I don't know if people actually watch it, they just look at it and move on. But that was actually the kind of conclusion of that talk, was to say, it's not just enough to tell people what we know, we have to tell them how we know it. You have to explain how you come to these findings, because that's part of how you build credibility. And if you think about a court case in law, the prosecution can't just say, here's the evidence and give a handout to the jury, right? They have to construct a story. They have to tell a story about, why this person was in the place at the right time to be able to commit this crime and had the motivation to do it, and to work the narrative, to work the facts into a story. So in a way, I think, and the defense has to do the same thing on the other side, to tell a story that, cast doubt on the first story, right? So I think that's really important. And many people, there's a slogan that says, in a fight between facts and stories, stories always win, right? Any Hollywood director will tell you that. So explaining how you came to your findings is part of constructing a narrative of credibility, I think, that shows, and it also relates to the transparency question. Here's what we did. Here's why we did it. Here's why we even undertook this question in the first place. One thing I often talk about in the United States that always floors people, most people have no idea how old climate science is. And so sometimes I'll start my story with the work of Dave Keeling. Everyone here is familiar with the Keeling curve? Yeah? No? No? Yes? Okay, so Dave Keeling was the person who first undertook the systematic measurement of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so there's something called the Keeling curve, which is a graph that shows, you've probably seen the curve, even if you don't know that, that's what it's called. It's in all the IPCC reports, it's in every World Bank report on climate change, et cetera, et cetera. And he won the US National Medal of Science for this, which he received from George W. Bush, a president who's not generally considered to have been a great leader on climate change. So sometimes I'll say to my audience, so why did Dave Keeling decide in 1958 that he was going to dedicate his entire life to doing nothing but measuring carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Why did he think that was an important thing to do? And people say, yeah, good question. Why did he think that? And then the answer is because scientists had already predicted that if you put more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it's going to change the climate. And they predicted it based on thermodynamics, 19th century science. This was understood theoretically, but people also knew that there were some complicating factors. For example, the ocean absorbs carbon dioxide. So it could be the case that most of the CO2 released from burning fossil fuels would be absorbed by the ocean. And so Dave wanted to measure it in order to find out, was the CO2 just staying in the atmosphere, or was it being absorbed by the oceans, or maybe being taken up by plants? And that was the question that he set out to answer. And 30 years later, he had the answer. And when you tell it to that, people that way, like, oh, that makes sense, right? And then suddenly Dave Keeling is not easily demonized. He's a man with a question that he sets out to answer. He dedicates his life to answering it. And now we know CO2 in the atmosphere has increased. It's about 40% since the pre-industrial levels, right? Now, it doesn't solve all your problems. People can still say, so what? Why should I care the CO2? But then you at least have engaged them. Now you're in a conversation. And now I can move on to, well, here's why you should care. But now the question's coming from them. And now, so that's, now you're on more of a conversation and less of lecturing to the person.
So Professor Oreskes just arrived today from the United States, so she has had a very, very hard day, and I ask you for your understanding that I will take only one more question, which then will be of medicine. So sorry for that, but thanks a lot already now for.
And you can always follow. Yeah. I'll crash after this. And you're always welcome to send me an email. I'm extremely easy to find. As far as I know, I'm the only Naomi Oreskes on the planet, I think, but I know for sure I'm the only Naomi Oreskes at Harvard. So
yeah, thanks. I can ask a last question today. It kind of adds to the question before, because I was thinking, it's basically not about science itself, but it's about the role of science in society, especially in mass media and the public sphere. This is what I was always thinking about. Maybe what has changed is the role of expertise. In all those historical debates, it often was about scientific authority versus another scientific authority. Those were the fights. The question is this concept of authority, which is based on a kind of idea of expertise, of scientific expertise. Maybe this has changed with the change of media, with the structural change of the public sphere. Maybe scientists this role of expertise just doesn't work anymore. And I'm not sure if it will just change when we find better narratives or talk about our methods. Maybe, and this is one idea, maybe you should as a science, talk about this. Why do we always have to find narratives? So this narratives is always like a posteriori rationalization of the whole process. Basically, when you're honest, there is no narrative. I mean, it's very like this complexity of the scientific process cannot really be told. So maybe it would be more interesting to talk about how did I find this way through when there was no way, and then you basically land on this question of performativity of audiences, like one scientific truth can be told to 100 different audiences with kind of always like a little different story. Yeah, and the question is, what do you think about this?
Yeah. Well, I say there was a lot in that.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. So let me see if I can just pick up a couple of the threads of that complex and interesting fabric. On the issue of telling a story, yes and no. Yes, absolutely, you're right that any collection of facts, any collection of pieces of information can be woven together into an infinite number of different narratives. I think that's true. So in that sense, there's no true story of any scientific discovery or any scientific work. But on the other hand, people do seem to be interested in the human dimension of scientific work. And as I just said, when I tell people, and I knew Dave Keeling, he worked at the University of California where I worked, and also it's easy for me to remember that Dave started in 1958 because that's the year I was born. And so the Keeling curve and I were born in the same year, so that's like a weird destiny thing, right? And also was part of the International Geophysical Year, which as a historian of geophysics I'm very interested in. So I find that, so there is a story. I mean, Dave did decide to do this for a very particular reason. He had a question that he wanted to answer, that he saw as important, and that's true. I mean, that's not like a rational reconstruction. So I guess I would make a distinction between the Reichian rational reconstruction of science, which is a falsehood, right? I mean, it's artificial. It's not how science really operates, and many people made that critique of Reichenbach, earlier in the 20th century or in the mid-20th century, versus a story that explains to people why you undertook this work in the first place. And that seems to me something that many people are interested in. And I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. I don't know why that's so important to people, but I find when I give interviews, one of the most common questions I get, say, from journalists is, well, how did you decide to write Merchants of Doubt? Where did the idea for this book come from? Or how did you and Eric Conway start working together? People are really interested in origin stories, and that seems to be there aren't a lot of cultural universals, right? We know that from anthropologists, but the interest in origin stories seems to be very, very widespread. And so maybe that's something that we can use and to say, well, here's why I got interested in this, or here's why that seemed like an interesting problem, or here's why Dave Keeling or Roger Revelle or Mike Mann or any of these important people did the work they did. And if you can understand what motivated them to do the work, then maybe that also helps you say, okay, well, then I see why that was important. And then you can get to the findings and say, and I agree, by the way, it's funny, for years I never used the word truth in my talks. I always talk about findings and evidence and stuff. And then I decided I felt that was getting a little fetishistic too. And I've actually recently written a paper in which I've said I think we have to get over the idea that we can't use the word truth or only use it if it's in scare quotes. But that's another whole lecture. But just to finish the thought, that if you explain where the findings come from, that it seems that for some people at least that is more persuasive than simply just saying, here are the facts, here's your IPCC report, right? So if it were up to me, the IPCC report would be much, much shorter, and have less factual information and more of a narrative about why scientists are doing this work, why it matters. And then, the IPCC is also another lecture, but if it were up to me, if anybody asked my opinion, I would say the report should be much shorter, and it should basically say, here's who we are, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, and here's the latest findings, here's what's new since the last report, because all the rest of it hasn't changed, and it's the part that hasn't changed, which in my opinion is the stable basis for policy.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you. This was great. Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for wonderful questions. And as always, when you attend talks here outside, you can find find pretzels and water and wine, and there's enough stuff to talk, I think. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.